This talk is an expansion on the topic of unconsciousness. Unconsciousness is the product of the illusion of separation, the belief in duality. And the perception of duality begins with the child. At some point, the child, before words, perceives that they are a thing in a world of things. So this talk is specifically about the imposition of unconsciousness, the process by which unconsciousness gets established, and then the process by which unconsciousness is undone, if it's undone, which it's typically not. It's like a zipper. It zips up one way and then zips down the other way. So unconsciousness starts with the perception of duality, which creates body identification. The child is identified with the body at first. So there's a bunch of impulses, So a little baby child is just a bunch of overactive orifices and survival impulses. Like when I tell you that a little child like that is more conscious than a grown-up, one would argue that, well, children are not inherently good. And that's true. They have no mind identification yet, but they have body identification. So immediate gratification of impulse predominates their behavior. They haven't been hemmed into a system of right and wrong through mind identification, through identification with thoughts, ideas. Those ideas have to be impressed upon the consciousness of the child to form a mind. So the child perceives duality, and then appears fear for the body. And so the impulses are all survival based. And of course, no matter what, there's the hunger drive. That's part of the hardware. But the body identification comes first. And then when fear necessitates the creation of a mental agent to further serve the body in this world, the I is grabbed onto. The I is the root of the egoic structure. And then from there, how everything above that root of I grows depends on circumstance that forms the conditioning. So the parents you get, your zip code, all of those things, all those identifiers are established, and a system of values is established. And so these things form a fingerprint of identity. And in unconsciousness, the perception of separation from others is a function of the amount of overlap between that fingerprint of identity. So an easy example of this would be your tribe, your people. At some point, you discover that there are people with different identity fingerprints, different tribes, and that you are separated from them in some way, or they are separated from you in some way. There can be different degrees of insularity between tribes. So when tribes come in contact, one may be more open to the other than vice versa, because the conditioning itself, there's a parameter within that conditioning called insularity. And that's just the required degree of identitarian fingerprint overlap for there to be cooperation or affection, maybe some other things. So this perception of separation, the effect is on the empathy that the person has. So a culture that dehumanizes others by virtue of exceptionalism, it allows for a lesser degree of empathy for outsiders. There could be an extremely high degree of empathy for insiders, but not for outsiders. There can be at the extreme, there can be a dehumanization of outsiders. In the perception of separation, unconsciousness really is a diminished ability to perceive how others might perceive. Not in a strategic way, not in like a chess way of anticipating what the other's move might be. That's more of a cognitive kind of empathy of, well, what would I do in this situation if I were them? That ability to strategize against another in a gaming sense is not necessarily precluded by insularity. What insularity takes away or is the ability just to feel the other person's pain. So you're not apart from the theory of mind in insularity necessarily, but the ability to feel the emotions of others goes away because there's a codified dehumanization of the other. So the idea that their feelings even matter is cauterized. There's a cauterization of the empathy in insularity. And the degree to which that is successful is exhibited in the cost of being inhumane. So you may have two individuals from the same tribe, same insular tribe, and in, say, the process of conquest, there could be the harming of innocence of another tribe. The true believer who is cauterized of heart, the dehumanization of the other in them is such that they are protected from the consequences of empathy, meaning they can commit atrocity against the dehumanized other with virtual impunity. But his fellow, who may be less successfully cauterized, would pay an emotional toll for committing acts of wanton genocide, wanton violence against innocents. And so you could measure this in the face of violent activity in the level of, say, PTSD or early checkout, so to speak. So that's a description of the mechanism, like the separation that's created through culture, the separation from the other. So some cultures are more insular than others. So you'll notice that different cultures do have varying propensities for violence. And in this regard, one could substitute in political alignment for culture, because that is an aspect of culture. Different cultures within one society are going to fall in different places along the political spectrum. And the propensity for violence, it is predicated on body identification, but its prevalence is a function of the mind identification of the culture. And if we see one group having a greater tendency towards violence than another, it's based on the distance between actual circumstance and the mind's ideal. So if you have two groups that are both identified with a particular way that the world should be, the more violent of the two is, in most cases, unless violence is just hard-coded explicitly into the culture itself. Like if they are Klingons, Klingon type people, violence is just part of their culture. It doesn't matter how the world is. They're always going to be violent because that's part of their culture. But a culture that uses violence as a means towards some end, which they all do eventually if the world gets too far from their mind's ideal, meaning that perhaps they're being pushed to the brink of extinction. At some point, the distance between their reality, which could be, being genocided, and the mind's ideal, which is just existing, that gap can get so big that violence becomes necessary. But apart from that, the distance between the way you want the world to be, not the way you need it to be just to be alive, but sort of a discretionary idea about the way the world should be, that gap can also cause violence. So like the more idealistic, the greater the propensity for violence. The more idealistic relative to the status quo, the greater the motivation for violence. So if the status quo is quite distant from your utopian ideal, then violence is more likely to be sanctioned by that group. This is what makes utopians so dangerous, is that they have an idea about the way the world should be that could be quite distant from the way that our instincts would want it to be. Like human beings are a certain way. We seek gain. We seek the liberty to have gain. And the farther from that natural tendency to just sort of take what we want when we want, the greater the distance between the status quo and the ideal. So like we are human beings, we are not ants. We are cooperative, but we're not as cooperative as, say, ants or other eusocial insects. But the ideal, the utopian, has an idea about how humans should act that's closer to eusocial insects than primates. And so the gap between our natural state and the ideal state is far greater. And it would take more control, more force than, say, just persuasion to get that ideal. I read a book by Dr. David R. Hawkins called Power versus Force. And I think he alludes to something similar. Maybe not explicitly, but I think that's the idea of the book, is that force is coercion, violence. So to get the human being organized in a way that's farther from where we would naturally tend to go requires coercion. And there's a maddening effect to being bent to that so far from what our natural tendency would be. Like a Clockwork Orange, which I've alluded to. A Clockwork Orange is something that would seem natural on the outside, looks like it's working the way it should. It's the ideal, but the reality is there's a great distance between it and the way we would naturally be that makes for pathological behavior. So in the world we live in today, we see that there are groups that are more prone to violence. Their ideal is farther from reality than, say, other groups whose ideal is where the status quo is somewhat closer to what their ideal is. They tend to operate more aligned with the winner takes the spoils, which is more of our way. Our way is kill the men and take the women. Just look at history. I've said it many, many times. And ironically, at a day-to-day level, when not in the mode of conquest between groups, those types might be less inclined to sporadic violence because they want order. To have a good life, there needs to be order and stability. And we want a good life. But if through conditioning, our mind is bent towards some unrealistic ideal, even if we have all of those trappings of a decent life, let's say they're not quite ideal, they never are quite ideal, but the mind's ideal points to a utopia, well, then we would trade this default level of order that we have in the status quo for some potential higher order, and thus want to perpetuate or perpetrate violence towards that end. So you can use your imagination and think about the way things are today, and think about who perpetrates violence and who doesn't within the society. And actually because the most violent nations have some ideal that's far from reality that they're trying to accomplish. So back to the original thesis of this talk, and that is sort of the order of operations within unconsciousness. Unconsciousness starts with body identification, then is deepened with mind identification. So body identification gives the requisite fear that motivates the creation of the mental agent to serve the body. And then how the expression of consciousness relates to others has much to do with that very fingerprint of identity, the details of it. This is why you have different modus operandi between groups, the particulars of that conditioning. So the zipper goes from body identification to mind identification. And then to leave unconsciousness requires an unzipping in the opposite direction. So suffering is the gap between reality and the mind's ideal, between circumstance and the mind's ideal. And that is thought-based. So with strong body identification, the person, how they act at the micro level is kind of determined by their level of body identification. So like strong body identification would make you more of a coward and probably more of a pervert. Things that serve the body. Strong body identification, maybe the appetites would be greater in stronger body identification. There's less discipline around the ability to regulate the body in deep body identification. And that can bring suffering if there's an inability to meet the creature needs of the body, the food, the sex, the safety. But in mind identification, there's a different kind of suffering. Mind identification can overcome the fear-based aspects of the body identification. So the sublimation of sex or the parameter of violence, sort of that slider, can be moderated through the mind's conditioning, like, discipline, the discipline of the mind that can be conditioned in through repetition. But the unzipping of the egoic structure towards the ascension, spiritual ascension, the ascension of the ethereal body, both in terms of its vibration and position and flow, that begins with the mind. That begins with the noticing of thoughts as what causes suffering. We are subject to what we hold in mind as it relates to suffering. And so that zipper, you grab it by the mind. The mind presents ideas that cause suffering. And so there's a noticing of, I suffer because I have something in mind that I desperately want, that I cannot have. And for my part, if there's one thing that takes up an inordinate amount of mental space, that is a thing that is really revealing the relationship between frustrated thoughts and suffering. And so there can be then an impetus to deal with this one unwanted thought. And if that one unwanted thought can be dealt with, the connection can be made between suffering and thoughts in general. And then this successful way of eliminating this one thought as an agent of suffering can be then generalized to all the other thoughts. And if that one thought occupies enough mind space, even its defeat as an agent of suffering can increase consciousness, create space. The ability to feel the ethereal body is a function of mind, of space, of unoccupied mind space into which the truth flows, the non-relative truth, the lack of an idea about the way things should be, and thus a greater alignment with the way things are, is a function of space. And there's something palpable in that, because in the lack of space, in the saturation with thought, there's this deadening of the perception of the ethereal body, of the energy body. It's just emotions instead of unencumbered energy. The ideas about the way things should be color the energy body, and then making them perceived only as emotions. But in the relinquishing of the need for things to be a certain way, the lack of identification with ideas, this space allows for the ethereal body to be unmodulated by reaction to thought. So this method, I call it the modality of surrender. I didn't make that up though, is in dealing with a thought, the typical strategy is to countervail it with other thoughts, basically mitigating strategies. And really, this is just more of an idea about the way the world should be. And so that only is like a doubling down on unconsciousness. It proliferates more thoughts. It disconnects one more from the moment. And so there's not a success in that method of manipulating content. It may create a sense of relief, though, to delude oneself with ideas, even though there's a proliferation of ideas. Those ideas are some consolation, but they leave one operating within the paradigm of duality. They don't liberate from it. Instead, if attention is given to the feelings that underlie the thoughts, then there's not proliferation, because the feeling that we have that underlie thoughts, if we don't give attention to the content of thoughts, but instead to the feelings themselves, apart from the content that precipitated them, those feelings are not relational. They don't relate to the identity. And so they can just be felt. And that brings one closer to a one-pointed mind. A one-pointed mind that ultimately distills down to the thought I. And that I, if it is ultimately relinquished as the agent of self, if it is dethroned, if it loses the mantle of self, if it is surrendered back to its source, then there's no perception of being one to relate to anything, right? So that whole reacting to thoughts goes away. So liberation is not a matter of stopping the mind, but rather stopping the reaction to the mind by virtue of no longer being unconsciously identified with it and the body. But it's the mind with which we lose identification before the body. So the zipper is brought down in the opposite direction in liberation as it is in the development of unconsciousness from the child before words. So the spiritual journey has been characterized as this journey from being the child before words to the unconscious adult, and then back to the child, but with the benefit of the experience of seeing the whole process. And in this lack of identification with mind and body is a lack of fear that hides love, and a far greater empathy, an ability to really not just have a theory of mind about others, but also a perception of how they feel. So a theory of emotion and feelings, and it guides behavior. So this modality of surrender requires mindfulness, of noticing, right? So when there's an obsession, like a big obsessive thought, it's quite easy to notice that this thing is an agent of suffering. And in being dealt with through this modality of surrender, of feeling those underlying feelings and letting them go, they are, to the extent that then the energy body is perceived and the ascension of the energy body can be perceived, the thought is also recognized as an agent of lack relative to that feeling of love to which the energy body ascends. And this is what destroys desire, because it's realized that those things to which the mind points, the rewards, are always derivative of what one can already have in the absence of identification with body and mind. Like this mental agent is seen as something that is hoarding up one's loosh and dispensing it through side quests. And that changes the whole motivation, right? Because all an outside thing ever does is make you feel a certain way inside. So apart from just sensations, which can still be enjoyed even when there's no desire, the juice we get from circumstance is all internally perceived. And it's just a bringing closer together of reality and the mind's ideal that actually brings us into the moment. And in that moment is the perception of truth, the palpable perception of truth. But that window of alignment is only open so long as we can hold circumstance to the mind's ideal. And that's always a temporary proposition. So we're always ever looking for more novelty to bring the mind into alignment with the present. This is why people who have unlimited resources really get into weird things, is because it takes more and more to bring that alignment, right? Because it's not moved. There's diminishing returns. But desire is destroyed by the ascension of the energy body to the level of love, because what you have eclipses the product of all the mind points to. And so then life can be a challenge, because your whole motivator has been destroyed because you've discovered all the treasure to which the mind points. It's discovered to just be a dispenser that can be dispensed with. So there is a challenge of how to get back into the flow of life when the stakes are changed and one already has everything. So some might just become ascetics. And that asceticism, though it may be seen by others as a means towards liberation, in the truly liberated ascetic, it's more of a product of that liberation. They just don't need anything. So an ascetic life for them isn't a problem, because they have within them already that which could be gained in the Aladdin's lamp scenario, which really is hell. You know, to be unconscious and yet able to get everything one wants, that's just an experiencing of circumstances' inability to accommodate the mind by virtue of the mind's unlimited ability to want. So the Aladdin's lamp scenario could also be handled by the liberated being. The liberated being has the ability to handle both the asceticism and the abundance by virtue of not needing. I guess that's enough for now.